Hey everyone, I'm really excited about today's topic. We have our guest who's been on before. He is going to be discussing what has been already a very busy week from a news perspective. If you are looking at the aduhelm product and what CMS came out and talked about, you will care about today's discussion. If you care about COVID vaccinations and what the Supreme Court came out and said, you might be interested in today's discussion. So if you work in medical affairs, if you work in promotion, if you work in pharma, you're probably going to care about today's discussion. Our guest today is the professor of law and affiliate professor of history. He's also off counsel at Covington and Burling. He is co-author of the forthcoming 5th edition of Food and Drug Law, Cases and Materials, published by Foundation Press. He's also the co-author of the 3rd and 4th editions. And lastly, and not least, he's a member of the National Academy's Committee on the Security of the Medical Product Supply Chain. Our guest for today is Louis Grossman. I do want to emphasize, this is the Darshan Talks live stream, and I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. Louis and I are both attorneys. I'm also a pharmacist, and we advise companies on FDA-regulated products. However, neither one of us is your attorney, and I am not your pharmacist, so this is neither legal advice, nor clinical advice, nor regulatory advice. These are considerations, this is educational, and don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the host, the guest, or our employers or clients. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. Please feel free to ask our guest questions. You can always reach out to me on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. I will also emphasize that our guest has written several books, and I'm excited to throughout be sharing the book he's worked on recently called Choose Your Medicine. I will show a picture of it as we're talking, and you can go order it as well, and I'll share links as well. And you can also find him, he's at American University, so I'll throw out links to his bio page, so you'll be able to reach him there as well. I guess today, Louis Grossman. How are you, Louis?
Very well. Happy New Year to you and to your listeners. And thank you for mentioning I'm a professor at American University. My dean would have been very sad if we hadn't mentioned that.
Well, I'm going through your description, and you were quiet about law and affiliate professor.
My fault. It was my fault.
I didn't know if we had to play it safe. That's all. But I'm glad your dean would approve of his name coming up. So let's talk a little bit about how this has been a really slow news week. Nothing of importance has popped up. But what do you think? What's been happening in the news, and why do you think it's important?
Well, there are two stories this week that have really broad significance, or at least potentially broad significance. And I'd love to talk about both of them. One of them, which happened earlier in the week, is that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued a proposed national coverage determination that would not cover the new Alzheimer's drug, aduhelm, and other drugs that target amyloid plaque in the brain, except in very limited circumstances that we can talk about. Now, apart from the specifics of this drug and this disease, this has potentially broader significance because it is the first time I'm aware of that that CMS has declined to cover an FDA-approved drug, that at least an FDA-approved drug for a medical condition as opposed to a cosmetic one. So I look forward to talking about that. The other huge issue, huge story this week, is that yesterday the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay against the enforcement of the Biden administration's vaccine mandate issued by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And that has really significant implications for the way that the court is going to review actions of the administrative state, including FDA, going forward. So let's chat about that as well.
So let's start with the first one. Let's talk about the issue of aduhelm. So you first let's set the stage. you talk about national coverage decisions. Obviously, the flip side of that is local coverage decisions. Could you talk a little bit about the distinction between each, what it means?
Well, until there is a national coverage determination made, and I will say, by the way, that I'm not a CMS specialist, so I say what I'm saying here with some caution. But until there's a national coverage determination made for Medicare, the coverage determinations are made on a local basis. And indeed, CMS said that they will be continue to be made on that basis until its proposal becomes a final rule. But once the final coverage determination is issued, it governs Medicare for the entire country. And it is really important to note that the population for aduhelm and other similar drugs is a Medicare population. Medicare is a government program that covers the elderly. And although there are some very tragic early onset cases of Alzheimer's, the bulk of the people who will be taking this drug or who want to take the drug are actually Medicare patients.
So what I think is interesting in that case, the part that I can't really tell is CMS in many ways exceeding its jurisdiction? And what I mean by that is this idea that they're basically, the FDA has ruled that the product is approved and is deemed to be safe and efficacious. Medicare is coming in on its own, CMS technically is coming in on its own and saying, no, we're going to approve it for this. Well, let me rephrase. We will pay for it in this specific, for this specific indication, technically, which is during clinical trials. My question for you is, isn't that one agency deciding something that is technically the jurisdiction of another agency?
So it's certainly CMS treading into waters that have traditionally been FDA's bailiwick, to mix metaphors. So the safety and efficacy determination and the risk-benefit analysis have traditionally been an FDA job. And as a result of this, as I mentioned before, CMS, as far as I know, has always covered, had Medicare cover FDA-approved drugs for medical conditions. Where there have been some interesting fights is concerning whether or not CMS will cover drugs that FDA has not approved, or CMS coverage for drugs for unapproved conditions. This is different, and I think it is groundbreaking. And it's also important to look at the language of the CMS publicity around this and the proposed rule itself. They explicitly said that economic considerations had nothing to do with this. They said that they were doing their own independent assessment of the possible benefits and possible risks to their patient population. And so is this just completely unrooted in the law? Well, Medicare requires the coverage of reasonable and necessary medicines. And there's a lot of play in that language, and they ordinarily have ceded to FDA the ability to say, we determine as an agency that this drug is reasonable and necessary. Here, they are intervening in a way, or at least exerting their power in a way they traditionally haven't. Now, if I can, there's another very important thing to say about aduhelm, which is it was not a traditional approval. It was what is known as an accelerated approval. An accelerated approval is an approval based on surrogate endpoints. That is, clinical conclusions that the drug is having a preferred effect on a particular measurement of something in the body that has not been firmly established as having a clinical benefit for the patients. So this drug was approved on an accelerated basis based on its ability to reduce the plaque in the brain. And the dispute is whether or not that plaque in the brain and its reduction correlates to memory inhibition in patients. Now, when the accelerated approval system was born during the AIDS epidemic, the day after FDA released its accelerated approval rule, or maybe it was when it made its first accelerated approval, David Kessler, then the commissioner, immediately said, we expect this drug from a reimbursement perspective to be treated exactly like a regularly approved drug. And that's the way it's been dealt with ever since. Accelerated approval drugs have generally, if not always, been covered. What's going on here is that they are stepping in, CMS is, and saying, whoa, FDA is approving this based on less evidence, even though it's statutorily authorized to do so. We're not going to cover it. And that's why I think this is a groundbreaking decision. And let me add that accelerated approval is not some kind of rarely used procedure. It is a commonly used procedure.
So that raises so many questions. The reason I brought this up, by the way, this is from Axios, talks about Big Pharma's last-ditch lobbying blitz for aduhelm. So I found these specific comments to be quite interesting. So it says that different advocacy groups are going to be pushing for this, including, I find this language interesting, including those with financial ties. Well, I would expect the ones with financial ties to push for it, but the ones without would have been more interesting. But this is this comment from Zeke Manuel, I think is kind of interesting. It says CMS officials are being generous. You've got something unproven, and you've got to conduct a trial to prove it, and you're getting help from the government to do that. What could be better? Stop complaining. Is that a fair way to look at this?
Well, I don't know exactly what the basis for Zeke's comment was, or how broad an implication he meant to have. But would he have said that to the AIDS patients who were given an opportunity to access an AIDS drug for a deadly condition based on accelerated approval? I mean, I think the problem is that accelerated approvals have a range of evidentiary support. And the surrogate endpoints that are used have a range of certainty with respect to correlation with clinical benefit. And so I don't know whether he's saying they're doing the company a favor in this instance, or that CMS is always doing a company a favor by covering an accelerated approval drug. I'd be kind of astonished if he meant the latter. And it really is a striking development in the sense that you have CMS doing, as I said, a risk-benefit analysis independent of FDA. And, as time goes on and the pressure to reduce drug costs gets greater and greater, this is a place to look. We've always thought of FDA as the main gatekeeper, if not the exclusive gatekeeper, for drugs, or at least non-controlled drugs in the United States of America. Are we moving into a world where there are two gatekeepers, each making an independent risk-benefit analysis? Because as a practical matter, Medicare coverage or not can be a life, I don't mean life or death in the sense of the patient, life or death in the sense of the product, a life or death decision for a drug. And that's why I think that this decision this week has such enormous significance.
I think it's kind of interesting because it moves the US more towards a UK type scenario where NICE, the opinion of NICE of whether they will cover a specific drug has significantly more importance than whether I'm blanking what their version of the FDA is called, the UK's MHRA. If the MHRA approval will have the same weight. So obviously, in the US, we looked at, as you pointed out, the FDA as the primary, if not the only gatekeeper. But we might be moving towards a double gatekeeping process. And the FDA has considered that process before, because they have talked about several opportunities where they will coordinate with CMS in terms of approvals and sort of accessing the drug in the future. Do you
But if I can, that coordination has generally tended to be a coordination of timing rather than a coordination of analysis of the evidence.
Yes.
Indeed, the Food and Drug Act, and this is important for your listeners to understand, does not permit FDA to make economic considerations in reviewing a drug application. It is based completely on the clinical data and not at all on economics.
And that's exactly the question. So now what, and again, we don't really know too many details at this moment, but if CMS is starting to do an independent analysis of the data, they're really functioning now from being a payer to being almost a formulary committee. And the question is, what is the ramification of this independent analysis? And the battering ram. So unlike many other formulary committees, which might say we'll negotiate the price, CMS really doesn't have the ability to negotiate prices, but it does have the ability to say we just won't cover it, which is a much worse battering ram to address the issue of drug pricing. What do you see as the implications of this decision going forward?
Well, first of all, let me say that CMS does have some experience in formulary construction, because although they haven't gotten into the business of declining coverage for FDA-approved drugs, they have gotten into the business of approving coverage for non-FDA-approved indications. Now, I have to say that as an FDA expert, I don't really know what kind of infrastructure they have at CMS to be doing this scientific analysis. We know that FDA has a strong, big bench of scientists who do this on a daily basis. I don't know whether CMS has a similar infrastructure. But I guess to think about implications going forward, the narrower implication, apart from on this drug in particular, is what happens to accelerated approval. A very, very robust system. It's used all the time. Is it now going to be the case that that drugs approved according to the accelerated approval pathway are not going to be reimbursed, are going to be partially reimbursed? And one thing to mention is that when a drug is approved according to accelerated approval, there is then a subsequent obligation on the manufacturer to perform clinical trials to determine whether the drug has clinical benefit. And the FDA has more liberal power than it normally does to withdraw approval of an accelerated approval drug if those subsequent trials don't show clinical benefit. And indeed, it has done that in a number of instances. But going forward, the question is, what is the fate of accelerated approval as a practical financial matter? Will it be a situation where there is some kind of scaled reimbursement, no reimbursement, or is this case the exception? Because if it goes to a broader system of denying accelerated approval reimbursement, it's going to kill the program.
So, and I'm trying to keep some time to discuss the other massive bit of news that we got, but I want to ask this other question. Do you necessarily see this decision being tied only to the accelerated approval, or can we tie this to the other efforts around First Amendment rights and the ability for companies to basically tie the use of their product. I'm sort of actively thinking through this. I don't really have a framed question, but will companies be able to speak about their products on an off-label method, in an off-label manner, but would that necessarily not get tied to reimbursement? And that reimbursement, because it's always been tied to reasonable and necessary. And does that change? I don't know if I framed the question properly. I probably haven't, but if you want to respond.
Yeah, it's kind of jumping into a wormhole to talk very much about this, because it's already the case that outside the cancer area, Medicare generally doesn't cover unapproved indications. It does so very broadly in the cancer area. And so it's already the case that regardless of what FDA's position is with regard to off-label promotion, the government can still bring false claims actions against companies for allegedly incentivizing reimbursement of an approved drug for an off-label use. And one interesting thing is that the First Amendment hasn't really been tested in that area as much as it's been tested in FDA enforcement, where FDA's grip has been loosened to some degree because of the First Amendment. One other observation I have about this is CMS is getting into FDA's business, not only with respect to the overall coverage or non-coverage of these drugs this week, but it's saying that it will be covered if it is being used in a clinical trial. And although it's going to automatically recognize any NIH clinical trial as a reimbursable clinical trial, if it meets its standards, it otherwise is keeping a fair amount of control on whether the clinical trial is acceptable to CMS and has imposed various requirements on the clinical trials. And one of them that's interesting, by the way, is ensuring diversity of participation in the trials so that this trial is not just limited to a bunch of white patients. But, the traditional job of regulating pivotal trials for drugs has been FDA's job. And again, I'm not a CMS expert, so I'm not positive, but this is, if not unprecedented, certainly unusual for CMS to declare that we're going to have to basically approve your clinical trial in essence, because people won't be reimbursed if it's an unapproved clinical trial. Finally, another thought I have about this is normally you're not allowed to charge patients for participating in clinical trials. And when you can, and you have to get FDA approval to do so, the charge is limited basically to direct costs, to cost recovery. And so by limiting this to clinical trial participants, I think that CMS has limited its costs even more than most newspaper articles I've seen are acknowledging, because they won't be charging $25,000, I don't think, to people participating in the trials, because they're not allowed to charge that amount to people participating in the trials. I think I'm right about that.
That's a really interesting take. I haven't thought through that, so I definitely want to consider that a little bit more. I also want to be respectful of the fact that we're already at 24 minutes. Do you think we have a few minutes to go over the other decision that is kind of game-changing?
Well, as you can tell, I love talking, so I'm here as long as you can stand it.
I can stand. I love talking to you, so this should be fun. Let's talk about the second decision, the decision about OSHA from the Supreme Court. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
So when the Biden administration issued its vaccine mandate, it actually wasn't just one general mandate. Rather, he used several different statutes and several different agencies to implement it. For example, he mandated that healthcare workers get the vaccine, and he did that pursuant to the Medicare and Medicaid statutes. And indeed, the Supreme Court upheld that mandate yesterday, although it was a close call. It was 5-4. The one that was stayed yesterday was a vaccine mandate with huge implications in terms of the obligations of businesses and American citizens, that anybody who works in a workplace of over 100 people needed to get a vaccine pursuant to the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And what happened yesterday was that the US Supreme Court, it wasn't a final decision, it was a stay, but strongly suggested in a 6-3 decision with only the 3 remaining liberal justices dissenting, strongly suggested that this action by the Biden administration will not survive review because it was not, that Congress did not adequately authorize this particular type of action pursuant to OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Now, I think it's important, given the emotions around vaccines, this was not a constitutional decision. This was not saying that government doesn't have the right to mandate that people get vaccines. Rather, it was talking about the limits of federal power in light of the statute at issue. But it has huge implications for your listeners going forward in terms of what the relationship will be like between the judiciary on the one hand and the administrative state on the other hand. Because the Supreme Court in this decision yesterday seemed to embrace a doctrine, in fact, I think it pretty clearly embraced a doctrine called the major questions doctrine. Now, normally, courts have given a lot of deference to expert agencies to interpret their statutes the way that the agencies think will best advance the public interest. What the Supreme Court basically said yesterday was that when it comes to actions of, quote, vast economic and political significance, then the court will stop the agency from acting unless Congress has spoken very clearly in a way that allows them to take that action. And that is a very, very interesting doctrine, and a very wet noodly one, as my 3rd grade teacher would say, because what is vast economic and political significance? So what if FDA in the future were to reinterpret one of the exclusivity provisions of Hatch-Waxman? Well, that seems to have vast economic significance. Will they get deference? What happens when FDA next reviews and approves an abortion drug? Well, that's of vast political significance. In other words, it's a little bit unclear where this doctrine starts and where it ends. And I think, therefore, your listeners should keep an eye on this. It seems like abstract administrative law, but it's actually a very, very important moment in the history of the relationship between the courts on the one hand and administrative agencies, including FDA on the other hand.
I'm going to be honest, Louis, this is not an area I have any experience in. So repeat that whole thing for me in terms of what the actual implications are. So this doctrine, start from the beginning for me again. I'm sorry.
Well, let me back up. Administrative agencies, including FDA, are creatures of Congress.
Sure.
The powers they have are creatures, are products of Congress, namely the statutes they administer.
Yep.
In the case of the Food and Drug Administration, the main statute it administers is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, although there are some other important ones too, like provisions of the Public Health Service Act.
Sure.
Now, what does the Food and Drug Act look like? Well, in some places, it gives very broad delegations of authority in short sentences, broadly put.
Yeah.
In other instances, and increasingly over time, Congress sets down in great detail exactly what it wants FDA to do. But even in those situations, there's gaps and ambiguities and so forth. So while some statutes are what is known as self-executing, most parts of the Food and Drug Act are implemented through what are known as regulations, rules. These are issued through a notice and comment procedure, which the public or anybody else can be involved in. And if they go through and somebody thinks that the agency stepped beyond the borders of what it's allowed to do under the statute, in other words, it overread the statute, then a court can strike it down. Now, over the past half century or so, the court has had a quite deferential attitude toward this unless the statute is unambiguous. In the context of any ambiguity, there's something called the Chevron doctrine, whereby a court is supposed to uphold a rule or regulation so long as it is based on what is known as a permissible or reasonable interpretation of the statute. What you have seen over the previous couple of decades is a rising antipathy and practical war against the administrative state by conservative judges. And this has various aspects. One of them is Chevron, which may not be as firmly permanent as it seemed to be to observers a few years ago. There are certain justices who would love to just throw Chevron deference out the window and allow the courts to just decide whether the rule's okay or not. What happened yesterday was the use of it's not a brand new doctrine, it's been kind of floating around out there for a while, but it's called the major questions doctrine. Arguably, the first time it was ever used was in FDA world when, if you remember in the 1990s in the Brown and Williamson case, the US Supreme Court struck down FDA's effort to regulate cigarettes as medical delivery devices. They now have regulatory authority over cigarettes and chewing tobacco and other tobacco products, but pursuant to a very specific statute that allows them to do so that was passed in response to the Brown and Williamson decision. So this major questions doctrine, on the one hand, it simply reflects the court's attitude toward administrative discretion. And it also is something that we're going to have to work out exactly what it means, especially when it comes to what is a rule of vast economic and political significance. Because if it is a rule of vast economic and political significance, then the court won't be granting discretion to the agency. And it is interesting to note, while the court says that unelected bureaucrats shouldn't be making these decisions, rather Congress should, the last I checked, the US Supreme Court was not elected either.
That's really, really interesting. So it comes down to the deference principle that we've always sort of attributed to agencies like the FDA, and will that deference continue to stand? I find that to have, I mean, obviously just the decision itself in terms of whether the vaccine can be given itself has implications, but what implications it's going to have on future decisions by courts will be fascinating.
If I could just add one more thing, Darshan, I'm sorry to interrupt. For your health law focused audience, it's worth mentioning that behind this is also a general notion in the court's view that the regulation of public health is primarily a role of the states. So they weren't saying, again, that it's unconstitutional for a government to mandate vaccines. Maybe some of them think that, but that's not what they said. Rather, what they're saying is that a mandate like this shouldn't come from the federal government unless Congress has very specifically allowed it, but rather it should be coming from the states. A final interesting aspect of it, by the way, in terms of this mandate going forward, if you read the per curiam decision, which was the majority, though unsigned opinion, they suggest that if OSHA were to release the rule again, but this time cabining it, limiting it a little bit more, like to maybe workplaces where there is a lot of crowding or something like that, that the rule might have a different fate the next time around.
Very, very interesting. Again, this is fascinating. I'm really glad I had you on this week because there were so many implications we were discussing. I do hope you'll consider coming back again soon. I know you have some more interesting stuff that's percolating, if you will. So I can't wait to have you back for that. Any last parting words?
Are you going to ask me the 3 questions this time, or have we gone too far?
I'm happy to ask those questions. I always worry about I'm over time, but here, let me ask you the 3 questions. The first question is, what is the best way for people to reach you?
The best way for people to reach me is to look me up on the linked Washington College of Law American University website and contact me by email.
Very cool. What's something you'd like to ask the audience?
I'd like to ask the audience, and I love kind of broad cultural and societal questions. In what ways do you think American society will never be the same after COVID? And I would ask my audience to think really creatively of certain aspects of everyday life that have been, irretrievably changed. In what way has the office home balance changed going forward? I love movies. What's going to be the fate of movies going forward? It's now gotten to the point where when I'm keeping lists of movies to watch and TV to watch, I can't really even keep separate lists anymore. Is the idea of people going to a movie theater and watching movies done, or at least largely done, not because COVID will continue, but because we're all so used to watching these things streaming on our TVs now? So that's my question for the audience.
I'm going to answer that as the first member of the audience. So I think 2 big things. I think people who have saved a bunch of money in childcare are going to go, I don't want to spend that money anymore. Like, that's a lot of money. That was a massive, what should we call it? A massive pay raise. And I'm not giving that pay raise back. So I think remote work in many forms is here to stay. I think telemedicine, because of that, will be here to stay. It doesn't mean that there won't be any in-person doctor's visits or anything like that. Those have to continue, but they will be augmented very significantly by visits from home, by telehealth. I'm a huge movie buff, just like you sort of mentioned. So when you mentioned movies, my heart sang. But I think it's very clear for me, and I'm currently a member of AMC, Regal, and pretty much every streaming channel there is, including, and I still can't explain it, CBS, because there's really no good reason to be part of CBS. But, or Paramount. Yeah, Paramount, I think is what it's called. Anyways, the point being, it's very clear to me, I will go see any event movie in the theaters. So if I'm going to see stuff blow up, I want to see it in the theater. On the other hand, if it's a character building, a character development movie, my first question is, does it have to be a movie? I'd much rather you edit it, but don't try to make it all fit into a single hour or 2 hours. Maybe it's a little 4-part miniseries, and I can take that now because I don't have to swallow it all in one shot. And I want that to be a series I can come see over an 8-hour period and spend it with my family. So to me, that's what my future looks like. And it's interesting you mentioned movies because Ben Affleck had the same exact conversation, and I say that like I know Ben Affleck. I don't. I was reading something else. But Ben Affleck apparently there was this movie he came out with very recently. I'm blanking on the name, but it was about him and Matt Damon, and I guess there was a whole discussion about someone slept with the wife and false accusations.
Yeah, I watched it on TV.
Exactly. His point was it did terribly in the theaters, but on streaming it's done incredibly well. And he was like, "What happened?" And he thought that it was a good movie. When there's a bad movie and it does badly, he doesn't have a problem with it. But in this case, he was very proud of the movie and he couldn't understand why it did badly. And then he said, "Now it makes sense. The audience is on streaming platforms now." And I
will say, by the way, if you're talking about that movie, the name of which is slipping my mind, that's an event movie. That is a costume drama with broad, sweeping, vistas. And so if people are happy watching a movie like that on TV, theater movies are in trouble.
I think that's my problem. I think they advertised it as a character movie, to me at least. I saw it as a character movie.
Well, it certainly was. It certainly was a character movie, but on the other hand, it was a whole bunch of people dressed in medieval garb and having jousts and things like that. So it also slots into that aspect of Hollywood history, which is the big costume drama movie.
I guess there's a and we should have a whole conversation on just movies because apparently you like movies almost as much as I do, if not more. But to me, A Great Gatsby, for example, would never be a event movie, even though I can see the glamour of it taking over a movie screen. I would still see it as a character-driven movie. And I would go, I'm not sure I want to spend the money to go see it in the theater. My girlfriend would strongly disagree with me. But the point is that that's not where my mind goes. And I expect that there are people just like you who said, yeah, I can watch this at home and I'd be perfectly happy. So I think that's where the future of movies is. That's where the future of people is. And I think we're seeing that also in delivery, that the whole question of last mile delivery, we used to fight it for a long time. Like I can go to the store and there's something unique about picking out your clothes. And now we've kind of over 2 years gone, I guess it's not that unique. I'm happy with Amazon dropping it off at home and then me returning it if it doesn't fit. And I think that's where we are.
And what does that say about us as a already community challenged civilization going forward? When we lose our public spaces, I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing for the health of our republic.
I think that's a really interesting point. And I think the question becomes, will we engage because we have to or engage because we want to? And I think that's where we're going to start switching more and more towards. I think we're going to start seeing more events that bring people together because I think people miss other people. So I think you're seeing a bounce in the number of people who want to go to restaurants because they're saying, I miss people. But not as many people who say, I want to go to work because I don't need to be there, obviously. So that would be my take. We are well over time. This was incredible. Thank you so much for a good conversation. I can't wait to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Darshan. I look forward to being with you again at some point.